Hi, everybody. Professor Ken here, talking about the final draft of your novel, how to edit the final draft of your novel. I have no idea what episode we're on, but this is Write a Novel from Start to Finish. I'm going to say episode 12. I'm going to take a guess here and we'll see if I'm right. I'm here with Professor Sassy, who has no skills whatsoever when it comes to English or writing, so she'll be of no help to us whatsoever during this video. This video should actually probably be called something like Edit the Last Few Drafts of Your Novel, because once you get past like the third or so draft, what you can start doing from that point on is you can really just start sort of zeroing in on the problems that you notice as a writer. And you can also start zeroing in on places where you know you can write your story better. And for each person, this is going to be a different process. What I like to do once I get past about, like the third or fourth draft, is I really start to just zero in on what I'm trying to accomplish in each chapter. Okay. And I think what I'll do in the next video, I might actually make a separate video that just really reinforces that idea that you need to think about what your goals are with a chapter and what kinds of values you want to be shifting from chapter to chapter. I know I've talked about this a little bit, but I really think it's worth reinforcing this idea that if you come across a chapter and nothing really happens that advances the main story, that's something you're going to have to work on. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to delete that particular chapter, but it does mean it should be a chapter that you focus on in one of your next edits. So when I'm working on I've been editing a mystery novel that I was working on last year, and I actually, if you can see, I'm updating a video game on Steam and it's taking hours. So I literally just set up my laptop at my desk and I started doing some editing while I was waiting for this to finish. And I was starting to notice that one of the chapters, I was trying to do two things at once. I was trying to advance the story in two different ways, and it just totally was not working. So when I went through and I did like another edit, when I got to that particular chapter that was giving me problems, I made a decision, like, I'm only going to focus on one thing, advancing the story in one way. And so basically it was, my protagonist was coming to terms with the fact that the way he was trying to solve this particular case, and bring this criminal to justice, it just wasn't working, and he had to come to that realization in this chapter. But there was another thing happening in the chapter too, which was this idea that the criminal, they learned in this particular chapter that the criminal is starting to feel guilt. And both of those things were like in conflict in this particular chapter, which is why it wasn't working. So I took the idea of this criminal feeling guilt and I actually moved it later in my story so that this chapter isn't overwhelming the reader with a bunch of things that are happening. It's trying to more carefully think about pacing. Okay, so as you go through the next couple of edits, what you're trying to do at this point is you're trying to think of yourself very, very clearly as the editor, looking at a writer's work and trying to make that writer's story as good as possible. Okay, it can be a real challenge, and it can especially be a real challenge because you might feel like you don't really know what you want to change now that you've gotten away from this more structured plan that I've recommended. And my best advice to you is to really think carefully about how you're communicating the story and how you're writing it, and challenging yourself to identify those places where you know you can write better. Okay. And I know it seems kind of amateurish and I know it seems kind of simplified, but really a lot of the editing process at this point is polish. I don't like to use too many woodworking metaphors, but I do like that, I do think of, like, if you imagine your edits, your rounds of drafts, if you imagine them from like like a sandpaper perspective. You always start with the coarsest grit of sandpaper, and then you progressively move to finer and finer sandpaper. And by the time you get to like 300, 400, 500 level grit, which is really, really fine sandpaper, you're not actually taking any layers off the wood. You are just smoothing out that, the wood that exists. Okay. And I think that's a good way to think about these last few rounds of editing is at this point, you shouldn't really be making massive changes to your story. Rather, you should be thinking about how do you polish the story so it feels a little bit better, and then you go back through and it feels a little bit better, and then you go back through and you're kind of at a point where you're like, you know what, I'm not really making any changes anymore. Okay, so then here's my next recommendation, and I'm kind of squeezing a couple of ideas together in this particular chapter. But my next recommendation to you is to get a fresh pair of eyes on your story. Okay, you really, really want some outside perspective so that they can find anything that you missed. All right, because at this point, you're going to be really, really like dialed into your story. You're going to be very familiar with it. You want someone who doesn't know anything about your story, who doesn't have any of the ideas in their head that you have in your head, and you want them to experience your story fresh. And then what your goal here is with this peer review, what your goal here is to get as much feedback as possible on what's working and what's not working in your story, what questions they have, and then you go back in and you revise it for like the final time or the second to final time. Okay. Let me give you a couple of suggestions here because I think a lot of writers make a mistake when it comes to this particular step. I would strongly recommend against giving your edited novel to family and friends. Okay. And the reason I would recommend against that is because most of them are not going to give you honest advice anyway and honest feedback. They're just going to be like, oh, it was good. Some of them might think it's good because they're used to, watching really crappy movies and horrible TV shows and sometimes really bad books. But more importantly, and this is where I think it becomes like a huge issue, is even if they know something is wrong, or even if they know that something's not working, if they don't have a background in storytelling, if they don't have any experience with creative writing as an actual discipline, it's going to be really hard for them to articulate exactly what's wrong. Okay. So what they'll tend to do is when you give it to your family and friends, they'll give you feedback, but they'll either try to change the story you want to tell, or they'll give you feedback that's kind of hinting at something that isn't working, but they don't know how to help you fix it. And that's not super helpful. Okay. So I'll give you two ideas. There's a low cost idea and there's a more expensive idea. The low cost idea I have for you is join a writing group. Find a local writing group. Make sure it's a group that meets in person, ideally, because online writing groups can be very dynamic. They fluctuate in membership and people disappear. And very often people don't hold themselves accountable to giving each other feedback unless they meet in person and have to like look the other people in the eye. Try to find an in-person writing group. Get familiar with that writing group. Try to give them a chapter. Try to get a sense of who can provide you with feedback. And then when you find a couple of people in the writing group who clearly are good at giving feedback, bump into them after the group is done meeting and offer them a couple $100 to look at your entire novel and give you feedback. And what you'll find is oftentimes instead of like requiring payment for this kind of thing, they'll basically say, hey, yeah, I'll look at your entire novel. I'll give you a ton of feedback. But in exchange, I want you to look at my novel and give me a ton of feedback. Right. And so you get that really experienced feedback ideally, but you're also getting some experience of reading someone else's work and giving them feedback as well. And this is a really nice low cost solution. When I write something, I always give my drafts, my final drafts to some of my former classmates from my writing program. They're my friends, but they also are very mean and brutal to me. and they're very honest with me, which I absolutely love. And so I have that support system set up so that I'm always getting a fresh pair of eyes before I send something out. Okay. Now there's a more expensive version of this, which is you can find a freelance editor to help you with your writing. And freelance editors, the price kind of varies, but a very good freelance editor is somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 typically. Okay. And what they're going to do is they're going to go through your entire book and they're going to give you what's known as a developmental edit, which means they're going to focus on how to develop the story, the characters, the setting, and think about those upper level craft techniques that they can give you feedback on that you probably wouldn't get from a writers group, and you definitely would not get from family and friends. Okay, so it's of value. But let me give you a couple of pieces of advice if you decide to go down this road. And I'm speaking entirely from my own experience. I do professional freelance editing with a select number of writers every year, and one of the things I try to emphasize is not only am I working on this particular novel with the writer, but I also want to be able to articulate why I'm making the suggestions I am. I always want to think of myself as a teacher and a mentor in addition to an editor. So when when I have a phone call with a writer and we're talking about part of the novel they've written, I'm giving them suggestions for how to revise their story to make their story better. But I'm also trying to explain to them why I'm making these suggestions. Okay. And this is really important. There are a bunch of geese outside, and you can hear them screaming, which is driving me insane. You hear that? Anyway, so when you think about a professional developmental editor, you really want to make sure you find someone who's willing to teach you as they give you feedback. Because I think if you're going to pay like $3,000 for an edit, one, I think you should be getting some really good feedback. But I also think that the editor should be taking the time to teach you as well. It should feel like almost by the time you're done with it, you should have gotten some feedback that is informative in a way that'll make you a better writer when you decide to write your next novel or you decide to write your next short story. You should be able to take a bunch of that knowledge and carry it with you into your writing career. Okay, so look for developmental editors who are willing to do that. You're not going to find them on places like Fiverr.com or Upwork, because a lot of those editors tend to be hurried and they focus mainly on line editing. They don't tend to give you a lot of really good advice, and they're not very good at teaching you how to become a better writer either. Now, I know there's obviously exceptions, I get that, but by and large, I would say avoid those whenever you can. The other thing I think you should try to do, if you decide to go with a freelance editor, if you decide you're going to take that step and you know for a fact that your book is good, you like it, you know it needs work, but you also know that you need to learn more as a writer, you need to learn more about the craft, definitely don't be afraid to contact an editor and get a sample edit from them, okay? Don't be afraid to ask them for like a sample and say, here, can you look at 10 pages and just give me a sense of how you would help me? Because I think that'll help you make a really good decision about who to pick, which is really a great thing to do before you make that kind of investment. And also, not everyone is going to gel with you personality wise. And so that's a big part of it too, is you want to think a little bit about, finding the right person who's going to meet you where you are skill wise, to ensure that they're giving you as much feedback as they possibly can. Okay. So this is going to be the end of the editing part of the whole process. What I'm going to do over the next couple of weeks is I'm going to talk specifically about publishing. I'm going to show you how to find an agent. I'm going to show you how to query publishers. And then I'll dedicate a separate video to showing you how to self-publish like a pro, so that you can avoid a lot of pitfalls. And there are a lot of pitfalls when it comes to self-publishing. My goal is to make it as cheap and affordable and as revenue positive as possible for you. Okay. So stick with me. Remember to hit the like button. Congratulations on getting this far. And don't be afraid to leave any comments if you have questions.